In a world where judgment often overrides compassion, one cruel insult would set off a chain of events that no one saw coming. It happened at a bustling fast food restaurant where a young worker made the mistake of belittling a humble janitor, a man who appeared to be nothing more than an invisible figure in the background. But what this fast food worker didn't know was that the janitor's true identity would shatter everything he thought he knew about success, power, and the world he was trying to climb. How far would a seemingly harmless insult go? And what was the real cost of underestimating someone? The fast food restaurant buzzed with the usual midday rush, the familiar hum of fryers, the clink of soda machines, and the chatter of customers who came in, grabbed their meals, and left without a second thought. Behind the counter, 19-year-old Tyler was on his lunch shift, his face scrunched up in annoyance. His shift had been long, and the customers were particularly demanding today. He had dreams, big dreams, of getting out of this low-paying job and into something better, something more prestigious. He'd recently been applying to various office positions, desperate to leave behind the greasy fast food kitchen and the monotony of working for minimum wage. But the path to success was proving difficult, and it felt like he was always stuck in a cycle of disappointment. Tyler had spent months imagining a different life, one where he wore a sharp suit, spent his days in air-conditioned offices, and had the kind of status he'd never had before. But for now, he was trapped behind the counter, staring at the same dirty floor every day and feeling the weight of his unfulfilled aspirations. On this particular afternoon, the restaurant was busier than usual. Between flipping burgers, filling drink cups, and answering orders, Tyler's patience wore thin. He glanced out at the dining area, where the elderly janitor, Mr. George, quietly worked, pushing his broom back and forth with a rhythm that had almost become unnoticed by everyone. Mr. George was a fixture in the restaurant. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with wrinkled skin, graying hair, and an air of quiet humility. He had been working at the fast food joint for years, cleaning up after others, but never once had anyone asked him anything beyond, "Could you clean this, please?" His presence had become a subtle reminder of what most people considered to be the bottom rung of the social ladder, an invisible role, one that didn't merit respect or recognition. Tyler noticed Mr. George as he wiped the grease-streaked windows, but for some reason, that day something about the old man caught him off guard. There was a slow irritation building inside Tyler, a frustration that he couldn't quite pinpoint. Maybe it was the constant reminders that people like Mr. George would never rise above their station. Or maybe it was because Mr. George had that air of silent resignation that Tyler found both irritating and unsettling. Regardless, the sight of the janitor filled Tyler with an unspoken disdain. "Hey, old man," Tyler called out, a half smirk creeping onto his face. He was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Do you ever get tired of being here? This place is a joke. You really think anyone's going to notice you sweeping floors for the rest of your life?" His words were sharp, dripping with the arrogance of someone who thought he was destined for bigger things. Mr. George didn't respond right away. His eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible sadness, but he didn't let his emotions show. Instead, he continued sweeping, maintaining a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Tyler's flippant tone. But this only irritated Tyler more. To him, the janitor was invisible, just another cog in the machine, someone who couldn't fight back. Little did he know that Mr. George's silence would be the last thing Tyler underestimated. As the shift went on, Tyler's words echoed in his mind, a lingering voice in the background, haunting him in ways he didn't understand. Something about insulting Mr. George seemed wrong, but it was too late to take it back. Or so Tyler thought. He was about to find out just how wrong he truly was. The next few days at the fast food restaurant felt heavier for Tyler. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off after his exchange with Mr. George. At first, he tried to brush it off. After all, who cared about some old janitor working in a place like this? Tyler had bigger things to worry about: his applications for office jobs, his desire to break free from this life. But as he glanced across the restaurant, he couldn't help but feel a nagging sense of guilt every time his eyes landed on Mr. George. It wasn't as if Tyler had never seen the old man before. He had worked with him for months, each shift blending into the next, the janitor quietly sweeping the floors, wiping the counters, and taking out the trash. Mr. George didn't ask for attention. He didn't demand anything. But there was something Tyler couldn't quite figure out about him, something that made him uncomfortable. Maybe it was that the janitor seemed at peace with his role, something Tyler couldn't relate to. Mr. George wasn't ambitious, or at least not in the way Tyler imagined people should be. He was content with his place in life, resigned even, while Tyler was fighting every day for something better. On one particularly hectic afternoon, Tyler's frustration reached its peak. The orders were coming in faster than he could keep up. The kitchen was a mess, and the constant buzzing of the register was enough to drive him mad. A manager came in, demanding that Tyler stay an extra hour to help cover a shift, and the pressure only increased. He felt trapped in the cycle of endless work, an unending grind that seemed to get him nowhere. When Tyler saw Mr. George again, pushing his broom through the dining area, the irritation welled up inside him once more. Mr. George was moving at his usual slow pace, his head down, lost in his thoughts. He had no idea the storm brewing just beneath Tyler's surface. "Hey, old man," Tyler called out again. But this time his voice was colder, more biting than before. "What's it like to be invisible, huh? To be stuck doing the same thing day after day, never going anywhere. Must be nice to give up on life so easily." The words stung more than Tyler realized. They weren't just about Mr. George anymore. They were a reflection of everything Tyler felt about his own life. Stuck, frustrated, and desperate to escape a future that seemed as grim as the floors Mr. George was endlessly cleaning. Mr. George paused, his broom halting mid-sweep. There was a long silence between them. Tyler waited for a response, but none came. He almost felt as though Mr. George was ignoring him on purpose, which only made him angrier. The janitor's lack of reaction was somehow worse than any retort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. George spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "You think life's about doing something grand? Being something more than who you are?" Tyler snorted. "Yeah, it is. That's how you get ahead in life, right? You got to climb the ladder, make something of yourself." Mr. George didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply shook his head slowly. "Climbing ladders, running after success, it's all just noise if you don't know who you are. I've worked a lot of places, young man, but it's not the job that defines me." Tyler was about to snap back with something sharp when the manager Karen called his name from the back. The moment was broken, and Tyler, with a final sneer in Mr. George's direction, turned and hurried toward the kitchen. He didn't have time to deal with old men preaching life lessons, not when his own future was at stake. But as Tyler worked through the evening shift, he couldn't shake the words Mr. George had said. He found himself thinking about them more than he cared to admit. Was he really so obsessed with climbing the ladder? Was that what life was all about? Success, wealth, status? Or was there something more? Days turned into weeks, and Tyler's frustrations continued to build. His job applications were met with silence, rejection after rejection, and his dreams of escaping this life seemed to get farther and farther away. Every time he stood behind the counter, wiping down tables and making small talk with customers, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his unfulfilled ambitions. He watched as other workers came and went, college students just passing through, middle-aged adults trying to make ends meet, all of them moving forward in their lives. And there he was, stuck in the same place he'd always been, with little hope of changing anything. It wasn't long before Tyler's resentment toward Mr. George began to grow, fed by his own bitterness. The janitor still worked silently in the background, pushing his broom with the same steady rhythm, never showing any sign of discontent. But Tyler couldn't understand it. How could someone like Mr. George be so content with his position? Didn't he want more from life? Didn't he dream of something bigger, something better? One afternoon, Tyler overheard a conversation between Mr. George and one of the regulars, a young woman named Sarah who had come in every day for lunch for years. Tyler was standing near the counter, busy with orders, when he heard Sarah ask Mr. George about his weekend plans. "I'm just heading to the park to sit and enjoy the weather," Mr. George said with a soft smile. "Maybe read a book. There's a quiet peace in that." Sarah chuckled. "You're always so calm, George. I wish I had your ability to just enjoy the simple things." Tyler's eyebrow arched. He was ready to dismiss it, to assume Mr. George was just some naive old man. but the way Sarah said it made him pause. She wasn't dismissing Mr. George, like everyone else did. There was a respect in her voice, a quiet acknowledgement of his way of life that Tyler couldn't quite grasp. The next few days continued in the same pattern. Tyler working, his frustration building, Mr. George quietly sweeping. But one day something changed. Tyler was manning the register when he saw a well-dressed man enter the restaurant. He wasn't a regular, and he definitely stood out from the usual crowd. Tall, with sharp features and a crisp suit, he looked out of place in the fast food joint. The man scanned the room, his gaze briefly landing on Tyler before shifting to the back, where Mr. George was working. To Tyler's surprise, the man walked toward Mr. George, a look of recognition in his eyes. The two exchanged a few quiet words, and then the man placed a hand on Mr. George's shoulder, nodding appreciatively. Tyler was too far away to hear their conversation, but he couldn't ignore the exchange. Mr. George knew him? Tyler watched them for a moment longer, a feeling of unease creeping up his spine. Something was happening here, something he didn't understand. Mr. George wasn't just the janitor. Tyler could see it in the man's posture, in the way he spoke to the well-dressed stranger. There was a connection there that Tyler didn't know existed. The man left soon after, and Mr. George resumed his cleaning duties, as if nothing had happened. But Tyler's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the image of Mr. George and the stranger, and for the first time, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the old man. What was Mr. George hiding? Why was someone like that talking to him in such a familiar way? And why did it seem like there was so much more to the janitor than he'd ever realized? As the day wore on, Tyler couldn't focus on his work. His curiosity was consuming him. He needed answers, needed to know who Mr. George really was. The shift was winding down, and Tyler was on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming, that the strange encounter between Mr. George and the well-dressed man was only the beginning. His mind kept replaying the scene. Mr. George, the janitor, calmly speaking to a man in a suit, a man who had looked at him with respect. Tyler couldn't make sense of it. Every time he thought he had Mr. George figured out, something new was revealed. The old man was more than he appeared, and Tyler was determined to get to the bottom of it. As the restaurant began to empty out, Tyler found himself with a rare moment of peace. The hustle and bustle had quieted, and the clatter of trays and voices had died down to a low murmur. Mr. George was still at work, sweeping the same spot he always did, as if time itself hadn't passed. Tyler couldn't help himself. He had to know more. He waited until the last few customers left and the door chimed with the final departure. Then, without thinking, he walked over to Mr. George. "Hey, Mr. George," Tyler said, trying to sound casual. "Can I ask you something?" The old man glanced up, his tired eyes meeting Tyler's. He didn't speak right away, as if he was waiting for Tyler to say more. "I saw you talking to that guy today," Tyler continued, his voice a bit more forceful than he intended. "The guy in the suit. You two looked pretty familiar with each other. What's that about?" Mr. George's gaze shifted briefly to the floor, his eyes studying the ground, before looking back up at Tyler. There was a long silence between them. Tyler's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for an answer. He couldn't believe he was asking this, but he had to know. The confusion inside him had reached a boiling point. "You're wondering why a man like him knows a man like me," Mr. George finally said, his voice quiet but steady. Tyler didn't say anything, but he nodded. The old man seemed to take this as an invitation to continue. "The truth is," Mr. George began, "I'm not just a janitor." "I've never been just a janitor?" Tyler furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Mr. George leaned on his broom for a moment, his eyes distant, as though he was revisiting a chapter of his life long since closed. "I used to be someone else. I was once the CEO of a major tech company. I built it from the ground up. I had everything: power, money, respect. But somewhere along the way, I lost it all. I lost my family, my friends, my health, everything that really mattered. And when I lost it all, I decided to step away, to leave that life behind and find peace in something simpler. I became a janitor because it was the only thing that didn't demand anything from me. It didn't ask for power, it didn't require ambition, and it didn't give me false hope." Tyler stood there, frozen. His mind raced, trying to process what Mr. George had just said. The man in front of him, the one he had mocked, the one he had underestimated, was not only a former CEO, but someone who had once held the world at his feet. You, you're telling me you were a CEO? You're telling me you were a CEO? Tyler's voice was barely a whisper. But why? Why would someone like you throw all that away? You had everything. Mr. George smiled faintly, as if Tyler's reaction was both expected and understood. I had everything, yes, but I also had nothing. I was always running, always chasing the next deal, the next step, the next promotion. I thought that success would bring me happiness, but it never did. In the end, I was left with nothing but emptiness. I realized too late that I had been living someone else's dream, not my own. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Tyler felt his chest tighten as a deep sense of realization began to sink in. He had spent so much of his life fixated on what he didn't have, what he wanted to achieve, that he had never once stopped to think about what it meant to truly live, to be content with what was already before him. You don't understand, Mr. George, Tyler said, struggling to find the right words. I've worked so hard for this. I've been applying to jobs, trying to climb the ladder, and nothing's working. I'm stuck here and I hate it. How can I just accept it? How can you? Mr. George's gaze softened and he took a step closer, his voice lowering with compassion. Tyler, it's not about accepting defeat. It's about understanding what truly matters. The ladder you're climbing might take you to the top of the world, but it won't fill the hole in your heart if you're climbing it for the wrong reasons. I thought I needed success, wealth, validation. But when I lost it all, I realized the most important thing was peace. True peace comes from within, not from external achievements. Tyler's mind was spinning. Every word Mr. George spoke hit him like a hammer. He felt a shift inside himself, a transformation that he couldn't quite explain. The anger, the frustration, the constant striving, all of it suddenly seemed insignificant. The world he had been chasing for so long was a mirage, a distraction from the deeper truth that Mr. George had discovered in his quiet retirement. But just as Tyler was starting to process the enormity of Mr. George's words, something unexpected happened. The door to the restaurant swung open, and in walked the well-dressed man from earlier. Tyler's heart skipped a beat as the man made his way toward the back, his eyes locking onto Mr. George with a quiet but intense recognition. George, the man said, his voice low and urgent, we need to talk. Tyler's stomach dropped as he realized that something was off. The man's tone wasn't just businesslike. It was laced with urgency, as if the situation had suddenly escalated. Mr. George stood up straighter, his expression hardening as he turned to face the man. What is it? Mr. George asked, his voice tense. The man hesitated before speaking again, glancing at Tyler, who had been standing frozen in place, watching the exchange unfold. It's about your old company. They're trying to come after you. They want to take everything you've built, everything you've worked for, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. Tyler's mind reeled. He had heard rumors about corporate battles, power struggles, and shady dealings in the business world. But this was something entirely different. Mr. George, the humble janitor who had seemed so peaceful, was now being threatened by his past. You need to come with me, the man said urgently, his eyes scanning the room. They won't stop until they get what they want. Mr. George looked at Tyler, his eyes locking with his in a moment of silent understanding. Then, without saying a word, he turned to follow the man, his posture resolute. But just before they reached the door, Mr. George paused, his gaze turning back toward Tyler. For a brief moment, the old man seemed to hesitate, as if making a decision. Tyler, he said quietly, it's never too late to change your path. Don't keep chasing something that doesn't matter. And with that, he walked out the door, disappearing into the night. Tyler stood there in stunned silence, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. His mind was flooded with questions. Who was this man really? What was his past, and what was he walking away from? And most importantly, what was Tyler's next move? The events of the past few hours had shaken him to his core. He had started the day thinking he knew everything, thinking that he had life figured out. But now he felt as though he had been given a glimpse into something much bigger, something more profound than he had ever imagined. Tyler didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to change, and it was going to start now. The weeks that followed Mr. George's sudden departure were a blur for Tyler. Life at the restaurant continued, and though the daily routines remained unchanged, Tyler found himself caught in a whirlwind of thoughts that never seemed to stop spinning. The encounter with Mr. George, the janitor who had, one quiet afternoon, Tyler found himself sitting on a bench outside the restaurant during his break, watching the world go by. He had started taking longer breaks, not because he needed the rest, but because he was beginning to understand the value of simply being present. The fast-paced world he had once been so desperate to keep up with now seemed distant and irrelevant. His mind was still buzzing with the questions Mr. George had left him with, but now there was a sense of calm that accompanied the confusion. He wasn't sure where his life was headed, but for the first time, he felt like he could breathe. As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw that he had a new message. It was from Sarah, the woman who often came into the restaurant during her lunch breaks. She had always been kind to Tyler, but they had never really spoken beyond pleasantries. The message was short but unexpected. "Hey, Tyler, I've been thinking about you. I know you've been working so hard, and I just wanted to say that I see you. You're doing great. If you ever want to talk or grab coffee, let me know." Tyler blinked, surprised by the message. He hadn't realized that Sarah had noticed him beyond his role at the restaurant. It wasn't that he expected anyone to notice him, but it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures could have a big impact. It was a stark contrast to the constant hunger for recognition he had once felt. He had spent so long trying to prove his worth, to make his mark in the world, but now he realized that validation came in unexpected forms. It didn't always have to be loud or flashy. Sometimes it was the quiet kindness of a stranger or a friend that made all the difference. Tyler tapped out a quick response. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot to me. Maybe we can grab coffee sometime." He smiled as he hit send, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with ambition or success. It was the kind of warmth that came from connection, from knowing that someone saw him for who he was, not just for the job he did. It was the kind of warmth Mr. George had spoken of, the peace that came from within, not from external validation. The next few weeks were a period of quiet reflection for Tyler. He didn't rush into anything new, but instead he began to approach life differently. He started noticing things he had once overlooked, the beauty in small moments, the satisfaction of doing something with care, and the deep fulfillment that came from simply being present. He began to find joy in his work, not because it was glamorous, but because it gave him a sense of purpose. Whether he was serving customers, wiping down tables, or making small talk with the regulars, Tyler started to see that his actions mattered. He didn't need to climb a ladder to feel valued. He was already enough. But Tyler wasn't blind to the reality of life. He knew that the world still demanded certain things of him, and he wasn't naive enough to think that everything would fall into place without effort. There were still bills to pay, dreams to chase, and the weight of uncertainty to carry. But for the first time, he felt equipped to face it all. He had learned the hard way that success didn't define a person. What mattered was how they lived, how they treated others, and how they found meaning in the mundane. One evening, as the sun began to set, Tyler found himself standing outside the restaurant, looking at the horizon. He had just finished his shift and was about to head home when he saw Mr. George walking down the street in the distance. The old man looked just as he had the day he left, quiet, unassuming, with a peaceful air about him. Tyler felt a rush of emotion as he watched him. There was so much he wanted to say, but he wasn't sure where to start. He hesitated for a moment, then walked toward Mr. George, his steps slow and deliberate. The old man turned as he heard the footsteps approaching, his tired eyes meeting Tyler's. "Mr. George," Tyler said, his voice a bit shakier than he expected, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said to me, about success and peace. I don't know what it means yet, but I feel like I'm starting to understand." Mr. George smiled gently, his expression soft. "It's a journey, Tyler. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's the start that matters. You're on the right path." Tyler nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the man who had unknowingly helped him see beyond his own narrow vision of success. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I don't feel lost anymore. Good, Mr. George said. That's all anyone can really ask for. You don't have to have everything figured out. You just have to keep moving forward. As the two stood there, in the quiet warmth of the evening, Tyler realized that the old man had given him something far more valuable than a job or a title. He had given him a new perspective on life, a perspective that wasn't about climbing higher or accumulating more, but about embracing the present, about finding peace in the now. As Mr. George turned to leave, Tyler felt a sense of closure, a sense that the old man had completed his work here, not just as a janitor, but as a guide. And for the first time in a long time, Tyler felt free. Free from the pressure to be more than he was, free from the fear of never achieving enough. He was enough, just as he was. The next morning, Tyler woke up early, a renewed sense of purpose in his heart. He wasn't sure where his life would lead, but he knew that he had the power to shape it. Whether he stayed at the restaurant or found a new path, he would no longer be defined by external expectations. He would define himself. As he walked into work that day, he greeted the regulars with a smile, his heart light, his mind at ease. For the first time in his life, Tyler wasn't chasing anything. He was simply living. And that, he realized, was the greatest success of all. Tyler's journey is a reminder that true fulfillment comes not from external success, but from inner peace and self-acceptance. We often spend our lives chasing dreams that are not our own, striving for recognition, wealth, and status. But when we pause, when we step back and reflect on what truly matters, we realize that happiness is not something to be earned. It is something to be embraced in the present. Mr. George's wisdom wasn't just about abandoning ambition or giving up on dreams. It was about understanding that we don't need to achieve more to be valuable. Our worth is inherent. And sometimes the greatest success we can achieve is learning to be content with who we are in the moment we are in. Tyler's transformation teaches us that we can find peace, even in the most ordinary of lives. The climb may be steep, but it's the journey that counts, and it's never too late to change course. If you enjoyed this story and the message behind it, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more impactful stories like this. Remember, life isn't about climbing the highest ladder. It's about finding peace within yourself and embracing the present. Leave a comment below and let me know how you're making changes in your own life. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay tuned for more inspiring content. Until next time, take care and keep moving forward.